Yeah, Javier.
Yes, I got it. Sure.
Oh, that's enough. Yeah. It'll be about 10 minutes. That's great. Okay. I have a question for you. Is it okay to speak up? So, is that something? Yeah, sure. Okay. Okay. People be interested. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Authors on Tap in Exile Bookville's long-running series, where we host amazing and talented writers who are in conversation with other amazing and talented people. I'm Javier Ramirez, and along with Kristen Gilbert, who's in the other room, run this beautiful bookshop at 410 South Michigan Suite 210. Tonight, we have an amazing show lined up tonight. So let's meet our esteemed guest. Rachel Greenwald Smith is the author of Uncompromising Art, Politics, and the Fate of American Ideal, and Affect in American Literature in the Age of Neoliberalism. Her essays appeared in VQR, The Yale Review, the LA Review of Books, and elsewhere. She teaches at St. Louis University. She'll be in conversation tonight with Rachel Galvin, an assistant professor of English at the University of Chicago. She's a scholar, poet, and translator. Her essays appear in Boston Review, Comparative Literature Studies, ELH, Jacket 2, Los Angeles Review of Books, MLN, and Modernism and Modernity. Her latest book, News of War, Civilian Poetry, 1936 to 1945, is an account of how civilian poets confront the problem of writing about war. We're really excited about this event tonight, so we want to thank everyone for tuning in, but please keep your cameras on during the event, but turn your mics off until the Q&A portion of the session. We want to welcome Rachel and Rachel. Have a great show, you guys. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm gonna get into the camera. Okay, I'm gonna start by reading a little bit from the book. And I thought I would start with just the first little bit of the introduction, and then I'm going to read a bit that takes place in Chicago, because here we are. Okay. Show me what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like, I reply to the call of the chant leader as hundreds of us march directly into a dead end. As we turn around and begin fighting our way against the crowd, which is surging toward the same sad fate, my friends and I discuss the obvious irony that this is, unfortunately, exactly what democracy looks like, a passionate crowd stuck in a disoriented scrum. We look for someone in charge. Finally, we find a lone shouter in a fluorescent green vest, trying to make herself heard above the chants, waving her arms behind signs proclaiming the virtues of equality, her tiny voice barely audible even when we are right next to her. One more block and turn right, she says. And I can't help a thought that has nagged at me since I was a child. It is a shameful thought because it is a profoundly anti-democratic thought, one that verges on all of the things we are protesting: chauvinism, tyranny, authoritarianism. The thought is this: why doesn't everyone just shut up and listen to the person in charge? The philosopher Jacques Rancière tells me that my hatred of democracy is ancient. It is as old as democracy itself, he writes, going on to explain that the word was initially used as an insult by those who saw in the unnameable government of the multitude the ruin of any legitimate order. My snarky interpretation of this is what democracy looks like draws from an older definition of the word democracy than the celebratory intentions of the chant itself. Still, I chant. Eventually, our group of confused citizens makes it to the main artery of the march. And as I chant, I mean both things at once. This is what democracy looks like: an incoherent mess of people who aren't listening, a crowd that can't see its own organizing principles, individuals who will not sacrifice their drive to get where they're going to an overarching plan. But also, this is what democracy looks like: thousands of people demanding to be heard, thousands of people managing to keep one another safe without any clear direction. It looks like the possibility for collectivity, self-governance, and solidarity. Because democracy refuses absolute authority, it requires a general acceptance of dissenting views, comfort with internal conflict, ad hoc alliances, and discouraging capitulations. And democracy requires compromises, ugly, makeshift, disappointing compromises. I am at the 2017 Women's March in Washington, DC as a result of several such compromises. I have compromised on my skepticism toward large permitted marches. I have compromised on my distrust of mainstream white feminism. I have compromised on my parenting, having left my kid at home for yet another weekend. I have made these compromises, but I cannot satisfactorily account for them. When 2 years later, in a class I am teaching about manifestos, a student presenting on the march's framing documents dismantles them in a convincing performance of intersectional analysis, I will have no justification for having been there. Another middle-class white woman tumbling down the first knoll of middle age, shaking her fist at the impermeable edifices of governmental buildings and monuments. I will give the student an A, attesting on the evaluation sheet to a successful performance of everything I have taught: rigorous close analysis, a nuanced approach to contemporary pieties, a virtuosic performance of no holds barred critique. And I will feel conflicted because I will recognize myself both in the compromiser, the person who went to the march despite all of its problems, and in the critic, the person who condemns such actions. I'm always finding myself in this trap, playing either the sellout or the hypocrite, the show or the ideologue. All around me, I see vocal affirmations of one stance and strident disavowals of the other. You're either pathetically moderate or naively radical, an apologist or a purist. Both of these positions, however, strike me as impossible to sustain. To take an absolute stance of refusal involves engaging in a Sisyphean process of self-purification, trying to scrub away the filth of complicity that will nevertheless continue to accrete simply from getting up and walking around in all of the rotten systems that undergird contemporary existence. As Alexis Shotwell writes in Against Purity, we are compromised and we have made compromises. There is no food we can eat, clothing we can buy, or energy we can use without deepening our ties to complex webs of suffering. But to say yes to compromise, to believe, as Shotwell writes, that compromise will be how we craft the worlds to come, whatever they might turn out to be, to say that because our current systems are rotten, we simply need to learn to live, make peace, and innovate within them, seems like the worst abdication of justice. I want to find a way of making compromises without celebrating them, to know the difference between compromise as a means and compromise as an end. And then I thought just quickly, I would read from this chapter in which I kind of go searching for uncompromising figures. This chapter is also about compromise in art. And since we're in an amazing bookstore filled with wonderful works of literature, it seems apt. And so one of the uncompromisers I find is the early 20th century avant-gardist, Margaret Anderson. And so I'll just read a little bit about her and then we'll move to the conversation. This chapter is called Her Hand on My Octave. I loathe compromise, writes Margaret Anderson in a 1916 editorial for her arts and literary magazine, The Little Review. The magazine, now best known as the first periodical to publish parts of James Joyce's Ulysses, was initially imagined as a vehicle for Anderson's commitment to challenging mainstream tastes. Anderson loathed compromise in editorial work, in art, and in politics. This was the high point of avant-gardism and school-based writing, but she still saw compromise all around her and the mandate that people, especially women, be even-toned, moderate, and reasonable. Anderson did not want to be reasonable. Writing on feminism in the magazine's pages, she proclaimed that a clear-thinking magazine can have only one attitude: the degree of ours is ardent. Ardor characterizes Anderson's tone, but it also becomes a value in and of itself in her editorial work. I loathe compromise, and yet I have been compromising in every issue by putting in things that were almost good or interesting enough or important, she writes in this particular issue. There will be no more of it. Against good poems, she wants to publish capital A art. She wanted art that could knock a person over, art that uses up all the life it can get. She invokes the modernist credo, art for art's sake, art for art's sake. but in an avant-garde reversal, insists that this means not a retreat from the world of politics and history, but a commitment to it. Revolution is art, she explains. You want free people just as you want the Venus that was modeled by the sea. She ends her editorial with a threat. If there is only one really beautiful thing for the September number, it shall go in and the other pages will be left blank. She meant it. The September 1916 issue of the Little Review includes 13 blank pages. Decisions like this meant that in the early years of the Little Review, Anderson was often broke. Her uncompromising stances didn't play well with funders who didn't want ads for their products appearing alongside paeans to Nietzschean ethics and radical feminism, or placed in issues with mostly blank pages. Evicted from her apartment and then from the magazine's offices, she even slept in a tent on the shores of Lake Michigan for a period of time. But as I have come to learn, because these are the kinds of details you always learn about female literary celebrities, her hair was always perfectly done, her suit always clean and flawless. I possessed one blouse, one hat, and one tailored suit, she writes in her autobiography. The blouse could be made to serve 2 days. Then I washed it by moonlight or by sunrise. Being of crepe georgette, it didn't need to be ironed. After storms along the lakeside that would leave her drenched, Anderson writes she would squeeze a few buckets of water from my suit, pat it gently into shape, hang it on a cord in my tent, and go downtown the next morning looking immaculate. In the Wikipedia entry devoted to Anderson, I find this choice phrase highlighted in the center of the page, written by Ben Hecht, a writer she knew. It was surprising to see a coiffure so neat on a noggin so stormy. It's utterly predictable and awful that this brilliant thinker would be characterized by her hairstyle, and yet I'm not sure Anderson would have objected, attesting in her autobiography to the tributes without which I could not live. You look so beautifully groomed. I'm oddly grateful for this description. I feel as if I can picture Anderson calmly pinning up her hair in whatever mirror she could find, having slept in the tent the night before. Perhaps she is in the bathroom of a lakeside restaurant, in the ladies' lounge in a downtown hotel, at a cosmetics counter in Marshall Field's department store. Perhaps she gazes at her hairline in the cracked, no, it would never be cracked, polished mirror of her own tiny compact. Do her hands shake? And if they do, is it out of financial worry or rage towards some political or aesthetic position with which she vehemently disagrees? From what I have learned about Anderson, it could easily be either. She has become a totem that I invoke on mornings when, after a brief and thin sleep, I twist loops of hair onto the top of my head and pin them with trembling fingers. It occurs to me that many of my friends are Anderson's progeny, stormy noggined women whose overall comportments are carefully composed in direct proportion to their anger, their desperation, their fear, their drive. A neat coiffure and a stormy noggin. This is a pairing of two disparate traits. The neat coiffure masks the stormy noggin to some degree, maybe as a matter of survival, maybe as a matter of social strategy. Is it a compromise? If it is not the kind of compromise that turns conflict into a sad peace. I find myself looking to Anderson, saint of ardor, revolutionary, and crepe georgette, to learn how to survive in this world as a woman, as a critic, as a friend, and as a partner, with this stormy noggin that I cannot seem to hide or tame, no matter how carefully I comport myself, no matter how many times I stand at the mirror and beg the flashing-eyed reflection to just try for once. Please try to stay calm, to be nice, to fit in.
Rachel, thank you so much for reading both of those sections and starting us off. This book is brilliant, provocative, powerfully written. It ranges so widely and is written in such an unconstrained fashion that I really deeply admire. It transgresses all kinds of boundaries between academic writing, public writing, personal writing. And it focuses on this term of compromise, which I thought we could start with, from a variety of angles. So you have aesthetic analysis, thinking about Terence Hayes and Claudia Rankine's poetry and the visual art of Glenn Ligon, and the political philosophy of Walter Benjamin and Carl Schmitt, surprisingly, a Nazi theorist. Beyonce appears, the Poetry Foundation here in Chicago, one of our major cultural institutions. And you have a personal essay on life under lockdown as well. There's archival research. You get it. I love the moment where you get into the Riot Girl archives and you pull out Sassy magazine. That really spoke to me. We're the same generation. There's also 17 magazine and Spin and so forth. And I loved reading about your experiences as a bassist for a female-fronted punk rock, post-punk rock band. So with all of this kind of orbiting around, maybe we could just start with like, what do you mean by compromise? Yeah. What does it mean to you? And why are you so firmly against it? Because in some ways this book could be called not on compromise, but against compromise, right?
Yeah. It's funny, I actually had a conversation early on with an editor about this, about whether the book was truly against compromise or not. And she was adamant that it wasn't. And I came around to the belief that I think she was right, because I had to confront, as I was spending, 2 to 4 years writing the book, however you calculate it, the fact that over the course of those years, I found myself making many compromises, as in my emotional life, in my professional life, and I wouldn't say that all of them were bad, right? So what I came to is that the book is critical of compromise insofar as we tend to think of compromise dispositionally as a positive thing. We tend to say that people who compromise are good people, or they're good at their, a politician that's good at compromising is a good politician. An artist who knows how to compromise in a way that makes their work more readable is a good artist, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And I wanted to ask why that was. And so the book is less a critique of compromising and more a critique of the mandate that we compromise, or the cultural value that we tend to put on compromise, both in politics and also in art. So those examples that you list are important insofar as a lot of them, I'm trying to think of a good example. Beyonce, for example, right? Beyonce absolutely is a sort of compromise artist in the sense that she pairs a sort of, I write about her performance in the Super Bowl where she had dancers dressed sort of using Black Panther iconography toward this like very capitalist endeavor to sell lemonade, which was like, this multi, platinum album. So that's a compromise, right? Yeah. But in the book, I don't really come down, I'm not interested in just sort of saying, well, for that reason, we have to discount her because like she's not really radical enough or whatever, but rather to say that she should make us think harder about the tension that exists between, say, the legacy of Black militarism and, the commodification of popular culture.
That was one of my favorite parts of the book. I really enjoyed your analysis of the performance. That kind of, you talk about compromise aesthetics. That's a term that you coin in the book. That seems to be an example of that, maybe. Could you maybe say more about what you mean with that term?
Yeah, sure. So by compromise aesthetics, I mean, I guess it ends up hitting on two different registers. One is the register of like the work of art itself, right? So I talk about David Foster Wallace, for instance, writing Infinite Jest. And he talks about, in an interview on the Charlie Rose Show, he talks about using the sort of endnotes in Infinite Jest as a compromise to do the kind of experimental work that he wanted to do in the novel and still manage to sell the novel. And so in that sense, compromise aesthetics has to do with works of art that bring together kind of radical gestures and sort of easy accessibility in some way. But, and I'm interested in that. I'm more in terms of where the critique lies, however, I would say the critique lies less in relation to those works of art. I'm going to say something kind of similar to what I said about the Beyonce example, less in terms of the works of art themselves and more in relation to the marketing machinery that then makes that style of art the only style of art that's offered up to us. So Wallace is one thing, But then the 3 decades that follow Wallace, during which literary fiction basically all has to conform to this model, where it has to be just experimental enough to get our attention, but not so experimental that it turns into, you know, Thomas Pynchon or something like that. And I'm interested in writers who play with that. So like I look at a writer like Percival Everett, who I think is really messing with his readers often by sort of seeming to write a really legible book and then all of a sudden slipping in something that's wildly alienating and really doesn't allow people to get comfortable with that. So I think, yeah, I think the aesthetic judgment of compromise aesthetics and the marketing apparatus of compromise aesthetics are sort of where I'm interested in locating expertise.
That's so interesting, because in some ways, the way you're describing it right now, it's like thinking about the afterlives of the avant-garde, like what happens. You have that analysis too of that famously contentious anthology of poetry, the hybrid anthology from 2009 that David St. John and Cole Swenson edited. You know, sort of like many people were unhappy with the compromises that were struck in that book. And it's sort of what you're saying about being formally interesting but marketable, right?
Yes.
Like somehow digestible in a way.
Yes, yes. And I wrote an initial article when I thought this book was going to be an academic book. I wrote an initial academic article that was partly about that American Hybrid anthology. And this was written, by the way, in 2014, so before the Trump administration, when I still, and most of us, I think, still thought that the big problem was centrist liberalism, not encroaching fascism, silly us. And at that time, at that time, what I was interested in doing is really lining up exactly what you're saying. I was interested in lining up this trend in praising aesthetic compromise on the one hand, and this trend on the left, which is the sort of appeal to centrism on the other. And then, you know, around 2015, 2016, things shifted a little bit in the sense that what I became interested in was the language of it became less of a sort of one-to-one project about sort of neoliberalism and centrism. And in the book that I ended up writing, it actually ends up trying to tangle with our contemporary environment and the belief, I think, among many people on the left that compromise is going to save us from the polarization that we're now facing. And I feel very adamantly that that's not the case. So in some ways, it ended up being it was porting a sort of Obama era argument onto the Trump era.
Okay, so I'm like, there's two different ways I want to go with that. But I mean, do you feel like, this is kind of a provocation, but do you feel like this book is kind of pro-revolution in a way? I mean, it's not an anarchist diatribe, right? Like it's not, but it really pits itself against sort of gradual incremental change. Right?
Yeah. That's a really good question. Probably. I mean, you know, in a way where I think in the lockdown chapter at the end of the book, there is a moment where I'm thinking about what makes social change and what it takes for privileged people to get jarred out of the sort of desire to make compromises, which politically means over and over again selling out vulnerable people on behalf of peace for privileged people. And I think there's one line in there where I said something like, it takes something dramatic like a lockdown or like a revolution. And then I sort of move on because I'm not going to belabor that point. But I wrote that and I sort of like sat with it. And even when I got the proofs of the book, I sat with it and thought about it. And I mean, I do think that it's a book. If it's not a book that's advocating revolution, it is certainly a book that is deeply skeptical about meaningful social change without some kind of major revolutionary change.
So to go back to the question of the role of art in politics or politically engaged art, and the bit that you read from the chapter about Margaret Anderson, a little review, you know, I guess I have like two different questions about that. What was there a moment when art didn't make compromises, right? Like, is there a time when the avant-garde could not really worry about the market at all and still survive, you know?
No. No, there wasn't. And one of the reasons Anderson is interesting to me is because she did go and like live outside because she tried so hard to be this uncompromising figure. And there were people like her, you know, but there are often people that had the level of privilege that she had. I mean, she could go sleep in this tent because she had friends and, you know, this community that was surrounding her. And she was this, you know, white woman with access to all sorts of privilege that allowed her to do that. So no, I don't think that this is like a nostalgia project for an avant-gardist purity that we used to have that we no longer have, but rather in terms of art, what I'm mourning is a time when it seemed like one could imagine oneself in that direction. And avant-gardists again and again found themselves entangled in capitalism in all sorts of ways, needing to sell out in all sorts of ways. But there was a time when it was common to imagine or position oneself against the status quo in theory and in imagination and sort of utopian dreaming. And now I think most people hear that or think that and think, oh, that's really silly of you. How could you ever imagine yourself as separate from the market? And I do think that that's a meaningful difference.
Yep. That now it's sort of a commonplace to think there is no outside to the market.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's true. I really do think that's true, but I think it's unfortunate that art isn't a space where one can still imagine what it would be like to try to produce art as if that wasn't the case anymore. And I mean, I shouldn't say that that's never the case anymore. There's still, you know, small presses that are doing excellent work publishing avant-gardist work. I think internationally, well, you know more about this than I do, but I think the international avant-garde is still much more robust than the avant-garde in the United States in some ways, because there's often more political urgency or perceived political urgency to those projects. But I do think that there's this sense if someone comes up through an MFA program in the US right now and it's like, I'm going to be an avant-gardist, that very quickly that person will be disabused of the notion that that's a good idea.
So to get back to Margaret Anderson, I mean, you said some things about her in the chapter, but what is it about her that you admire and that makes her stand out as a kind of salient figure who is uncompromising? I mean, the blank pages, and I love that. I love that she published a journal with mostly blank pages because nothing was good enough. But beyond that.
So there's two things about her that I love. One is that she wrote in an early editorial that she didn't understand why other people didn't think it was better to be passionate about something and then wrong than right about everything. So there's sort of, in the book, one of the things I'm interested in is how compromise becomes valued because it becomes valued as a disposition. Like mature people are compromisers. And she was very dispositionally against that notion. So I like that about her. The other thing that I like about her, maybe more importantly, is that she had this section in the little review called The Reader Critic, where she invited readers to write passionately about the works that she was publishing. And then she would sometimes get in there and like smirkily write back to them, like, you're wrong about blah, 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 blah. But she would publish the entire thing. You know, she would publish people arguing with her, and then she would publish herself arguing with them. And then sometimes she'd publish them arguing back with her. And these people would be like, you know, random. And at this point, you know, she was writing from the Midwest. So she was inviting people from, like, often women or young people that lived in fairly provincial places that didn't have access to, you know, major urban literary cultures, to write and engage with her passionately about these books and to fight with her. And I think that's so important. But yet it was a space of, you know, there's a space of generosity. She was like welcoming them to fight with her. And there's something about the coexistence of that sort of generous spirit with real debate, not even debate, because it was really kind of much more angry than that.
And she's an early feminist, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, she was a feminist. She was queer. She lived with a woman, Jane Heath, her entire life. Just a fabulous figure. My friend Melanie Nasir just wrote a book where she does much more interesting work with Anderson than I do. She looks at her archive, or Jane Heath's archive. I think she's really interesting.
Oh, it's great. Yeah, there are all these sort of unsung figures, like women writers and editors of Chicago modernism at that moment, you know, whose stories haven't been told yet. It's glad to see you spending time with her.
I feel like I can start to channel her spirit a little bit.
Yeah. She's right around here. So. So maybe we can go back to the idea of like how to bring about revolution.
Oh, yeah.
And you talk a lot throughout the book about solidarity and how difficult solidarity is. And you have all kinds of examples, like from the almost famous scene in the bus where everybody's singing and they put their beef aside for a moment as a kind of like epitomizing moment of what a harmony might look like. But I wonder if you could say what you kind of envision as like an ideal form of solidarity that gets away from liberalism and compromise.
Oh,
And then like maybe what are the problems with that? Why is it hard to get to?
that's such a hard question. I don't know that I have an idea of an ideal form of solidarity. I can say that the reason I got interested in the concept of solidarity was that I was very caught up in this vocabulary in the book of friends and enemies,
Yes.
which I draw from the Nazi thinker Carl Schmitt in all sorts of ways that are problematic and that I deal with, I think, I hope, I at least acknowledge this is really a problem, that I find this so useful. And this man was such a terrible man. But Schmitt, I think, is important as someone who is challenging liberalism from, albeit from the right, but he I think offers a kind of useful political vocabulary that people on the left can still make use of, or at least that's what I think. And one of his arguments is that politics is defined as the binary distinction between friends and enemies. And you can see how how that can get really fascisty really fast. But I think it is useful in the sense that what it reminds us is that politics can't be aimed at everyone being friends, or it ceases to be politics, in the sense that if you're in a situation, I suppose in some sort of utopian future, maybe that's the case. In the situation we're in now, when there's rampant injustice and incredible power disparities, the idea that we can all be friends, I think, often leads people, especially on the left, to think that they can make appeals to people who do not understand themselves as their friends, who do understand themselves as their enemies. And you get this kind of moving goalpost thing where it's sort of like, and you can see Biden doing this, this is just sort of like, if I just nudge this far, I'll get these people on my side. And it turns out not to work. And I think Schmitt gives us a good way of understanding why it doesn't work. But my friend Gloria Fisk, who's very bright, was reading the manuscript, and she was like, so, there are other vocabularies for this, for the distinction between friends and enemies. And she's like, what about the vocabulary of solidarity? And I think she's right that solidarity is sort of the political word for what I was trying to use the term friends for, which is just essentially like recognizing common interests and recognizing mutual interdependency.
Yeah.
And the need for mutual care across interest groups, but in concert with one another against some sort of common forces threatening. So I know it's an abstract answer, but to me, that's what solidarity is. And it's a concept that can remind us that we need to know who our enemies are, and that it's much easier to know who our friends are if we have a better sense of who our enemies are, right? I found this to be really useful when I'm talking with friends who are critical of some of the left protest movements, especially those that happened in the summer of 2020. I had some hard conversations with friends who objected to some of the tactics of those protesters. And I found that sort of being able to be like, remember who your friends and who your enemies are, could be kind of useful in sort of saying like, look, I know this person broke a window in your building, but they're fighting the enemy that we're all trying to fight right now, meaning fascism. And so in those conversations, I find that really useful.
So you wrote this book, mostly between 2016 and 2018, with a chapter written during lockdown as well. Is that right? That's sort of the temporal.
Yeah, I was doing some aggressive revising between 2018 and 2020.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because the book, it sort of opens and closes with bookended scenes. So we've got you at the 2017 Women's March to open, and then the racial justice marches of 2020 to close the book. And I was picking up that things had changed for you in the thinking and the writing between that kind of, because in the opening scene that you read part of just now, we have these kind of well-intentioned marchers being led into a dead end, right? Like it's a big muddle. And it's kind of, it reminded me, actually, you described the Riot Girl movement as a story of a collective vision dissolving into a muddle of passionate voices without direction. I felt like that could have been an apt description also for that scene at the Women's March.
Yeah.
So we go from this kind of to a kind of note of hope at the end of the book, hope for solidarity, hope for change, that's found in a collective movement, right? And it seems to me that some ground has been kind of traversed between those two moments. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that change, that shift in your thinking, and sort of where the book ends, kind of teasingly with the vision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's nice. Where did it start and where did it end? Well, I mean, I think my skepticism, I should say first that the two protests, the protest at the beginning of the book is the 2017 Women's March, a protest that as I read, was very skeptical of for a number of reasons. And the protest at the end of the book is a Black Lives Matter action, which was a interstate or a highway shut down in the summer of 2020. And I was not very ambivalent about that.
That was in St. Louis.
And that was in St. Louis. And so in some ways it's a cheat, in the sense that the kind of political action that I'm depicting at the end of the book is a kind of political action that I, even in 2017, would have greeted with less skepticism than the Women's March. So that tonal shift is partly a shift about where I was and what I was doing. But I think that the shift in thinking about democracy, because there is this pessimism toward democracy at the beginning of the book and optimism at the end of the book. And I think that the optimism at the end of the book strangely does come in the wake of the COVID-19 lockdowns, where it did seem to me that for the first time in the Black Lives Matter led actions of late May and early June that responded to the murder of George Floyd, that even the center left was willing to embrace forms of proto-revolutionary action, was willing to see the logic behind riots, was willing to stand with people doing, engaging in acts of civil disobedience. And, a lot happened in those years. It's hard to peg anything to one event, but if the center left does start to see the need for such things, to me it means we're moving beyond this sort of bad loop of insisting on compromise in a situation that's becoming increasingly desperate and increasingly impossible to compromise within, and maybe towards something else. Or at least that's how I felt then. Maybe now, 2 years later, once again, there's some questions. But...
Right. So I want to ask you about sort of the writing of this book. You've published a scholarly monograph, you've edited 2 scholarly volumes, you've done a lot of academic writing, and this is a turn, right? This book is a change in a lot of ways. And I was wondering if you could talk about that and sort of who you imagined as your readership as you were writing it, or maybe as you were editing it, and how that came to be.
Sure. It started as an academic book. I thought I was going to write another academic book, and then I found myself not able to write an academic book for a number of reasons. One of those reasons did have to do with the audience, where I spent some of the time, right before I started writing this book, I spent a year living in Iowa City with my partner, who was at the Iowa Writers Workshop at that time, and I found myself in conversation with a lot of incredible writers. And I was a scholar of contemporary fiction who was writing scholarship that I was hearing from these writers was not really accessible, or at least wasn't seen as accessible to them. And I know that increasingly now people are getting both MFAs and academic PhDs. I don't know that model seems very hard to me, that it requires like 10 years of advanced education, but if that's where things are going. But at that time, that wasn't happening as much. And even despite the fact that some
brave souls are getting both MFAs and PhDs. The truth is that a lot of people that are really engaging with contemporary literature are not academics. I mean, from booksellers to avid readers to writers themselves. And it just started to seem silly to me that I was writing scholarship at this with this sort of very small audience of scholars in mind about something that so many of us think about all the time. So that was a big part of it. And then I also just felt, as things were getting more politically urgent in this country, that it was getting harder and harder for me to sort of do what I needed to do to write what I would consider responsible scholarship and sort of cordon off a historically focused project from the way that I was feeling on a day-to-day basis. So the autobiographical stuff started coming in a way that felt non-academic to me. Although I should say to anybody who might be here or watching, who might be in a PhD program, that like the surprise for me was that I wrote a manuscript that I thought was unpublishable by either a trade press or an academic press. And then it turned out that academic presses were interested in it, because I think academic presses recognize that they want to be reaching out to readers beyond just scholars. And Grey Wolf was interested in it because they publish smart, interesting books that challenge people to read differently, I think. So
it's really exciting to see this kind of shift. I mean, I was saying this to you earlier, but I really appreciate the writing style. It's so engaging. It's so powerful. So do you feel though that there's a connection between the thinking in this book about neoliberalism and the thinking in your first monograph about neoliberalism?
That's a good question. I do. I think that I wrote this monograph about neoliberalism, and I co-edited an edited collection on neoliberalism, and then soon after that, someone wrote me and was like, "Will you write a chapter in my anthology about contemporary politics and literature and write about neoliberalism?" And I wrote back, "I have nothing more to say about neoliberalism. I will never write about neoliberalism ever again." I think it was really important background, though, that I felt like I had this sort of working conception of what was happening in the market and in the economy during this time, because I think that a lot of what I'm trying to argue in this book about compromise and compromise aesthetics happens within the context of the economic policies that we associate with neoliberalism. And from a writing perspective, I think I was able to shorthand, or at least I hope I was able to shorthand those things much more easily, having spent pages and pages pounding out all sorts of different versions of these things. It's like, the more you write about something, the shorter you can make it.
It's totally true.
And it becomes a sentence.
Yeah. Did you have any essayists who were inspiring to you in terms of prose style when you were revising this book? I mean, this is probably far-fetched, but I was thinking, of course, of Montaigne and his essays, because of we've got Uncompromised, and he's got, of cannibalism, of conscience, of smells, these kinds of titles.
I love that idea. I wish that was true, but it's not. Maybe I'll just start saying that. It sounds really smart. In terms of contemporary essayists, Eula Biss has been a huge model for me. I think that she writes about very, very difficult topics with incredible grace and lyricism, and I really appreciate her work. And found myself rereading parts of On Immunity in particular, because she's able to make this sort of a book that everybody should be reading right now while we're talking about vaccines. It's shocking to me that people aren't talking about On Immunity more. But really, like, the work with scientific detail and political theory that she's doing in that book, while also working with this personal narrative, is just phenomenal, I think. So yeah, her. And then on a more historical level, actually, I find Jem Didion to be, I know that's a kind of old, maybe in some ways problematic figure to be turning to, but I like her coldness. I like that sort of icy, her iciness toward herself is something that I find really interesting, and her willingness to make herself a figure of a sort of problematic figure in a really difficult social space, and to not flinch when she's looking at herself that way, I find really important.
Did you, when you got into writing about Riot Girl and writing about, all-female post-punk bands like your own, did you remember anything you'd forgotten or discover anything that surprised you? What was that process like, taking a cold, icy look at your own past?
Yeah. I mean, I I found myself looking at my adolescent self as like, oh, I mean, such a tragic figure in so many ways, but it definitely made me think about myself generationally more than I'd ever thought before.
That's interesting.
So I became really, and I this is something I think about writing one of the things I think about writing more about in the future. I don't think that there's been that much attention paid towards sort of the exennial experience of sort of sitting in between a time when my heroes were all kind of like anti-sellout Gen Xers, you know, and then the people who are 2 or 3 years younger than me, I feel came up at a time when everyone expected that they were going to have to market themselves because that's just the way the world works.
Yeah.
And I feel like I've always sat in this sort of uneasy space of both feeling like it's absolutely disgusting to self-market, but like it's this imperative and like a fool in either direction, basically. Yeah. And thinking about my adolescence in relationship to Riot Girl, I became really keenly aware of the generational gap between myself and my heroes. I mean, the people like Kathleen and Hannah now feel like they're my age. At that time, they were years older that I couldn't access. And I think someone like Hannah actually could really believe in revolution, really could believe that she was going to cause the revolution right then.
Yes.
And I looked at that and I thought I could do it too. And then I felt like I played the fool again and again when I saw that the revolution I was trying to get behind was an already commodified, already sort of marketed revolution, because I was growing up in the era of Nirvana and Alternative Nation and all of that stuff. So.
I really appreciated that part of your analysis where you talk about this. I mean, it's kind of amazing how Bikini Kill, like they put a complete blackout on any kind of publicity, right? Like no one can talk to the press. We don't want people to know this is an underground movement. Like cut it off. They were so mad when they made the cover of some magazines, you know, like tried to shut it down. And then you talk about how today, you know, kids get started by putting their, you know, uploading their songs to Bandcamp or YouTube or starting, I'm probably saying all the wrong social media platforms, but like, you know, but like Billie Eilish, I don't know, people who have sort of like already produced and like ready to be sold, and that's part of it, and that's a marker of success, not of like selling out.
It's unbelievable that we've come that far in that short period of time. I mean, this is sort of, again, to come back to your question about the avant-garde, this to me is the meaningful distinction, right? It's not like there weren't parts of Riot Girl that were commodified. It's not like Riot Girl existed thinking that it could exist completely separate from the market. Yeah. But there was a time in that case, I mean, if you think of punk as an form of avant-gardism, which I do, you know, there was a time when someone could at least, even if they were being foolish, set themselves up in that way. And I actually don't think that they were being foolish. I think that media blackout went a long way to protecting them from the same things that were happening to Nirvana at the same time. Yeah, you know, and Kathleen Hanna and Kurt Cobain were good friends, and she saw what it did to him. To have the, you know, machinery of major label thing take over his life like that. So
yeah. Well, you know, speaking of audiences, I wonder if we have any questions from anybody present virtually or in person.
I can't tell if there's anyone in the chat or not.
I don't know. There's some. Folks, if you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat. Are we also taking voice questions as well?
In the chat.
Okay, we prefer that you type your questions in the chat, please, if you have them. We're happy to take them.
I want to hear about your band.
I know.
Oh,
You came in, we started talking about music out of that.
yeah. Trying to like see you and also here, I'm gonna do this so that I can like both be on camera and see you at the same time. Yeah, I was in a band in New York in the aughts. We were a female fronted band called Looker. And it was me and my 2 best friends and 2 different male drummers during the time I played with them. And in the book, I'm kind of shuttling back and forth between my experience playing in that band and the music scene in the 1990s in Portland that I kind of grew up in, and thinking about exactly the transition you're just talking about between sort of Riot Girl and post and sort of millennial experiences and self-marketing, where and there it was even much closer, that during that, in that break, with that geographic break and that historical break, what happened were some really sort of important changes, even just on the level of like the way that our music institutions function. So like in Portland, for instance, shows were like shows were booked often by groups of bands deciding to book a show together, right? And they were friends. And they would do it so that they could support one another. And they would encourage, if there was a new band coming up, they would encourage that band people to show up early. And if you were kind of a jerk if you just showed up for the headliner, it's because you weren't supporting the new guy. And then, you know, in New York in the aughts, the way that bookers booked shows was by, you know, the slot, and they would actually benefit from having bands that weren't even similar to one another, because then they could get new entire crowds in 4 different times or 5 different times in a night, and they could make that much more cover charge. And my experience of it was that as a result, playing in the band didn't really resemble what I thought it would, you know, and I was like, I'm going to be in an indie rock band and it's going to be so great. And it was great in a lot of ways, but it revealed what the consequences were of those kinds of adjustments, those sort of structural changes in terms of the way that we market and distribute art. So that's partly what the chapter is about.
Can we find your music on the internet?
I think you probably still can. I think it's still on like Spotify and stuff like that. They put out a record after I left, but there was a record called Born Too Late that I was on. And my 2 friends who we played with, Nicole Greco and Bushra Al-Sadi, are still making music. You should look up their stuff. They're both amazing songwriters. I was just a hanger on.
Awesome. I wish we could ask you to play.
Yeah. No, that's like the stuff of nightmares. I haven't played for years. And I honestly still, my anxiety dream is not showing up late for a final exam. It's like showing up and having to play these songs that I have to play for the song and not reading.
Well, thank you so much for entertaining these questions.
Thank you so much. This is so fun.
Yeah.
This is really... Do a little outro.
Yep.
Thanks everyone for showing up. Uncompromised. We're gonna have signed copies. I'm gonna watch Rachel sign right in front of me. So authentic. Yeah, we ship all over the country. Come to the store, visit us. We'll have a stack of signed copies for you. And Rachel will be actually also at Printers Row Lit Fest this weekend. So check out the schedule and come see her. And so will you with this.
Oh yeah, that's great.
So thanks everybody for showing up. Thank you guys. Thanks Rachel for coming out for this, and everyone for showing up, and thank you sir for showing up. Hope you enjoyed the show. All right. Thanks everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.
Still very good.